Well, folks, this is our, how do we say this? We're in October now. The summer quarter officially is ended, so we are now in overtime, okay? This game has gone long. It's in overtime. Couldn't finish the book of Revelation in 13 weeks, it turns out. To really do this book justice, it's requiring a little bit more time. If you want to open your Bibles this morning, we are in chapter 19. There are 22 chapters altogether in the book of Revelation, so we are getting close. I estimate we'll have today and then 2 more weeks. According to my notes, we should be able to be finished here in that length of time. But we are getting into a very pivotal point in our study. Just to remind you, we are in the third of 4 visions, and I promise you the fourth vision is very short, so it won't take us much time to cover that one. But so far, with the third vision, we started back at the beginning of chapter 17. 17 and 18, we learned about what is described as the doom of Babylon. We learned that Babylon was their code name that they used for Rome, the city of Rome, and even the Roman Empire. And we saw the destruction of the Roman Empire through the eyes of some of these cities, these nations that had been conquered. We also, when we got to the beginning of chapter 19, we started seeing what was going on with heaven, with the rejoicing, particularly the rejoicing over the marriage of the Lamb. And we learned that the Lamb is another representation of Christ himself, and the bride in this case is his people, the church, the kingdom. So Christians would be considered his bride. And today we will be getting into the scary topic everyone's been waiting for, the Battle of Armageddon. And I've had a funeral going on today. It's been a really, this week, it's been a busy week for me, but I think I'm ready to talk about the 1,000-year reign this morning and this Battle of Armageddon and dispel some of the fears that you had. It's not as frightening of a topic as people have made it out to be for many, many years. So we'll be covering that today. And I think we're going to stop just short of getting to the overthrow of Satan. I think we'll get to that one next week. But last week I showed you this image from the doom of Babylon, where God was actually able to use some of the former allies of the Roman Empire to turn on Rome. God had weakened the Roman Empire from within. It began to collapse from within, and he made them exposed to the enemies from outside. So their army was conquered from these armies from the east, particularly the Parthian nation. And once they were in a weakened condition, these occupied nations that had been conquered by Rome, some of them for centuries, they took this as their opportunity to pounce and to put the final nail in the casket, if you will, on Rome's tyranny. They overthrew the Roman authority. So we saw the doom of Babylon presented here in chapter 17 and 18. And the doom of Babylon also went to the scene when you saw Rome smoldering and burning and smoke coming up. You saw some of the former allies, the rulers, these aristocrats, were moaning and weeping, and they weren't mourning over loss of life. They were mourning over their loss of prosperity and their power and their control that they once had as they were part of the Roman Empire. And then it shifted to the merchants who were also just making a big to-do out of their mourning. They had lost their trade practice. They had lost their prosperity. And so this image really does an interesting job. Here we have the scarlet beast that the prostitute of Babylon, the great prostitute, had been sitting on. Now the beast has turned on her. And the 10 horns, as we discussed last week, represent some of these conquered nations. And then with the beginning of chapter 19, it shifted to a very beautiful scene. This was the Feast of the Lamb, the wedding feast of the Lamb. And we talked a little bit of time about the traditional Hebrew wedding and how the different elements really fit well with what we read about with the Lamb of the wedding of Christ. Now, we're going to pick up our study now in verse 11. And verse 11 through roughly 16, we're going to see our final main image of Christ being presented. I want you to listen as I read this section, that so many things that were told about Christ earlier in the book of Revelation are repeated once again in this final image of Christ. This will not be the final reference of Christ. I'll continue to mark those and identify those for you when we get to them. But this is the last final image that we have of Christ. Verse 11, "And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, and on his head are many crowns. And he has a name written on him which no one knows except himself. He is clothed with a robe dripped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. Next section, verse 14. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has written, a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And from the description, here's an artist rendering roughly of what this image of Christ riding in, leading his army into this final battle would look like. Now, this description, this is actually the 11th image that we've had of Christ. We'll look at those in just a moment. But from the description that I just read, there are several things that should have sounded very, very familiar to you. And let me just list some of them. Earlier in the text, Christ was on a white horse back in chapter 6. Faithful and true was a way that he was described in chapter 3. He judges and wages war. That was also described in chapter 6. He has eyes like a flame of fire. These should sound familiar because we've covered all of these. That was way back in chapter 1. He wears a crown on his head, chapter 6, and repeated again in chapter 14. So we're seeing so many of these images bubbling up again. He has a name which no one knows. That was described back in chapter 2. His robe dripped in blood, chapter 7. He has a sharp sword coming out of his mouth, two-edged sword. It was described in chapter 1. Ruling the nations with a rod of iron, we saw that in chapter 2 and chapter 12. Treads the winepress of the great wrath of God. We saw that just a couple of weeks ago, chapter 14. And he is identified as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That was a huge verse for us just a couple of weeks ago in chapter 17. So from all of these descriptions, without a doubt, we can know that this image is Christ, the Son of the living God. And the people that received the book in the first century would have identified him immediately by these descriptions as being the Son of the living God. So we're up to 11 different references now. And like I said, this is the last main image of Christ, but there'll be some additional references that I'll point out when we get to them. Now, we will continue with this description. Verse 17, then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, come, assemble for the great feast of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and those who ride on them, and the flesh of all people, both free and slaves, and small and great. And then verse 19 is a real important verse. Verse 19 really, let me back up here. The Battle of Armageddon, as we describe it, is not detailed in description anywhere in the scriptures, but this verse here really describes the Battle of Armageddon just about as well as any verse that we have. It says, and I saw the beast. And who's the beast? This would be the Roman Empire, particularly the Roman emperors, the beast from the sea. And the kings of the earth and their armies. Who are the kings of the earth and their armies? You will remember back in chapter 16, John saw from the dragon and the two beasts, he saw protruding from their mouths demons that looked like frogs. And these demons went out and they started gathering an army. They started persuading, deceiving kings in the nation to fight in this last battle. That's who it's describing here. So you've got the beast that he saw and the kings of the earth and their army. So they have assembled now. And then the verse continues, assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse, that's Christ, and his army. So you see the table is set now for this Battle of Armageddon with verse 19. But let's talk about 17 and 18 for just a second. I think this is really interesting. The feast on flesh hasn't started yet, but this is kind of what it's going to look like. These feathered scavengers, I've told you before, it's talking about buzzards, it's talking about vultures, any of these scavenger types of birds have been summoned to come to this great feast of God, verse 17. And then it goes on and it says that these vultures will eat the flesh of kings, commanders, mighty men, horses, and those that ride on them, everyone, in fact. And it's really interesting that this particular passage is right here. We just saw this wedding feast in heaven for the wedding of the Lamb. So this is in sharp contrast, one feast against another. we have this grim banquet being presented in sharp contrast to the jubilant wedding feast of the Lamb that we read about back in verse 9 last week. One is a feast of joy for the redeemed, and the other is a feast of judgment upon the wicked. And the book of Revelation just does a marvelous job of comparing things, putting things side by side, just like Christ, when he was teaching parables, would put things in comparison, one beside another. He does the same thing in these visions. And then, as I indicated, the verse 19, let me read it for you one more time. It said, I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him, against Christ, who sat on the horse, and against his army. So, folks, this is the climax of this spiritual battle. And this has been hinted at for several chapters now, going back as early as chapter 16. And it's often referred to today as the Battle of Armageddon. Continue with our reading now in verse 20. And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. And these two, the beast and the false prophet, these two were thrown alive into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. And the rest would be the kings and the armies of these other nations, the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and the birds were filled with their flesh. So we see the birds getting an opportunity for this grim feast that was being described. So here's kind of an image of the Battle of Armageddon. And again, the battle is not described in the scripture, so there's just a lot of speculation about what the Battle of Armageddon looked like. But this image, this battle, has bothered people for generations. Many have speculated about it. Many have come up with all sorts of fantastic theories about it. And some people are just plain frightened about the Battle of Armageddon because they think it's something that has not yet happened, that's still occurring. Some people believe it's going to be a physical war that's going to be waged on earth with carnal weapons. And folks, it's not none of that is anything you need to worry about. This is not, and I repeat, this is not a literal physical battle. This is a symbolic spiritual battle. So many things in the book of Revelation are symbolic. I hope that I've impressed that upon you enough times over the past 14 weeks now, that so much in this book is not literal. And I've repeated for you, and I'll repeat it again before the class is over, the wrong way to interpret a vision in the book of Revelation is literally, because it was never intended to be interpreted that way. So this is a symbolic battle. It's a spiritual battle. This is a symbol of the fall of the Roman Empire and of the beast and of the false prophet. And both the beast would represent the emperors of Rome that were controlled by Satan during this time, and the false prophet were seized and thrown alive into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone, according to verse 20. Now, what can we tell ourselves about Armageddon, this place? I read it for you a few weeks ago. It's actually identified in the text as Harmageddon with an H on the front end rather than Armageddon, but Armageddon is our interpretation of it. This is actually a specific place on the globe that you can point to. You can go visit it if you want to. There is an Armageddon. It's in the land of Palestine. It is a triangular-shaped plain, very flat, and it is between three distinct mountains, Mount Carmel on the west, Mount Tobar on the north, and Mount Gilboa on the south. And it's also referred to on the map. You may find it as the plain of Megiddo is the name of it, and that would have been a name that they would have used back in the first century as well. And historians, if you read about Armageddon or the plain of Megiddo, they will tell you that this is the location on the earth that has the dubious distinction of more battles being waged than any other spot on the entire planet, if you can imagine it. This Armageddon was the location for that. And because it has been so notorious, and it was notorious even in the first century for this, Armageddon was used here in the text to describe this spiritual battle, being the location for the spiritual battle that was going to be waged between Christ and between Satan and their forces. So that's a modern day picture of Armageddon. I do think it's important for us, and I've said this from the beginning, that we need to try to interpret Revelation through the eyes of those that initially received it. So I think it's very important that we just ask ourselves the question, what did John actually see about this Battle of Armageddon? So let's list a few things here. In verses 11 through 12, The man sitting on the white horse, which had many crowns on his head, this is the Son of the living God. This is Christ. And Christ fought against the forces of Satan in this great spiritual battle. And Christ's army, this is the main point, Christ's army was victorious. He saw that in the vision. Now, he also saw a dragon. This is the same red dragon that he saw back in chapter 12, and it was identified in chapter 12 as being Satan. It's still Satan that he's seeing here as well. And John saw two beasts here in this image, and these are the same beasts that were allies with Satan that he saw back in chapter 13. So Christ's army took the beast from the sea. This would be the Roman emperors that were controlled by Satan. And he threw the beast into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, according to verse 20. So we've seen the demise here in this passage of the beast. And he did the same thing. His armies did the same thing with the beast from the earth, was captured and was destroyed by being thrown into the lake of fire. Now, I just want to remind you that earlier, back in chapter 16, John saw 3 unclean spirits coming out of the mouths of the dragon and the 2 beasts, and these demons resembled frogs, and they were sent out to assemble an army to follow Satan into this final battle. And we know from this text that they were killed in verse 21 by the sword that protruded out of the mouth of he who sat on the white horse from Christ. So the birds now have had their fill of flesh as well, according to verse 21. So that's what John actually saw. So the book of Revelation has been building up to this picture, in my opinion. The destruction of those forces that were responsible for the persecution of Christians have now been dealt with here on earth in vision form. Now, I'd like to do some unraveling for you as well as we go along, because there's a lot of conclusions that we can make and some that we probably shouldn't make. But what did this Battle of Armageddon really mean to the first century readers that received this book in the first place? It has been mistranslated over the centuries by a lot of us, but what did the first century Christians really think when they read about this spiritual battle that was going on? One thing that I will say for sure is they did not interpret it as a military, physical battle or a war that was going to occur thousands of years in the future for them in the plain of Megiddo. I mean, why would they have thought of that? That was not on their mind at all. Now, they recognized that Armageddon was an ongoing spiritual battle between the causes of good and evil. And further, they knew that they were in physical danger against the Roman Empire. They understood the threat that they had on their lives from this cult of emperor worship. But they were not expecting some sort of physical war, physical battle. They were Christians. They didn't have an army. They weren't expecting some rescue from some army in a physical plane. Now, they recognized that the real conflict was actually between Christ and Satan, between truth and error, between right and wrong. And this is a point I really want to make here. These Christians understood that there was a spiritual battle being waged. And I'm going to tell you why I know this is because this was explained to them some 30 years earlier by the Apostle Paul himself in the city of Ephesus. And remember, Ephesus is one of those 7 churches that received letters back at the beginning of the book in Asia Minor. What did Paul tell the Christians in Ephesus? He told them he implored them to put on the whole armor of God and to stand firm against the attacks of the devil, Ephesians chapter 6. And attacks of the devil to these first century Christians meant a lot more to them than it does to us today. I guarantee you, when they heard that from Paul, they were not thinking about this attacks from the devil as some sort of metaphor like we oftentimes interpret it. Attacks from the devil was a real peril, a real threat for them. This was a threat of spilling over from this spiritual war that was being waged in the spiritual realm. So I've heard Rex say this, and I want to repeat it as well. These first century Christians understood the book of Revelation like we will probably never understand the book of Revelation because they were living it. And so this was written to them based upon the issues that they were facing. Now, chapter 20, I want to get as far as we can in chapter 20. We're going to see now more of the aftermath. We saw the forces assembled to wage war against him who sat on the throne. We don't have anything about the battle itself, but now we see the aftermath with verse 1 of chapter 20. John wrote, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he took hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. I think the beginning of verse 2 is very interesting. John often writes in puzzles that we have to interpret what he's talking about and who he's talking about. He did not want to leave any doubt in our mind whatsoever who he's talking about here in verse 2. This dragon is the serpent of old. This is the Garden of Eden serpent, and it is he who is identified as the devil and Satan. There should be no doubt in your mind, because there's no doubt in the first century Christian's mind who he was talking about. This is Satan. And what about Satan? And so the angel bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So a lot going on right there. But by the end of the third vision, and that's where we are right now, getting close to the end of this third vision, Satan has lost all of his allies who he had directly controlled within the Roman Empire. They had been thrown into the lake of fire and destroyed. First the beast from the sea, and then the beast from the earth, and the great prostitute of Babylon herself was also destroyed earlier. Now Satan himself has been bound and thrown into the abyss, where he will be locked away and unable to deceive the nations as directly as he had once done so before. So Satan is bound. And folks, I believe this is the time frame that we are living in right now, here in 2025. I think this is the time frame that we are living in. Satan is now bound. He is in that abyss. We're in that 1,000-year period, that symbolic 1,000-year period that the text talks about. Yes, Satan is restrained, but he still retains the ability to influence and persuade mankind to sin. We have a sinful nature, mankind. And it can lead to wars, and it can lead to violent human atrocities, but Satan does not have the full command over nations that he once had, the kind of direct control that led to the persecution of Christians back in the first several centuries. Satan is still very dangerous, but he has been restrained and subdued. And I want to make this point today. Our lives as Christians today would be far worse if Satan were not bound. At this point in time, we would be facing the same sort of attacks of Satan like they were being faced with during the first several centuries, the early Christians. Now, it's very interesting to me that the fact itself that the text puts a time limit on Satan being bound, this symbolic 1,000 years, tells us that this is a temporary restraint on Satan. This is not a permanent restraint that he is under. So binding is not permanent. Satan will be released for a short time before the final judgment, according to verse 3. Now, we go back. Now, I want to talk about the 1,000 years and remind you again before I start talking about this, the caution that I've told you. We don't need to try to interpret vision language literally, and this is a really important case right here because there have been so many misguided and false doctrines that have been based on a literal interpretation of 1,000 years from this passage and this vision. But this, just like virtually every other number that's used in the book of Revelation, this number is not a literal number. This is a symbolic number. 1,000 years, as is being used here, is not a precise number of years and should not be interpreted as such. It is symbolic. It's very simple. It's symbolic of a long period of time or a prolonged period of time, as opposed to a short period of time or a brief period of time. That's really all he's trying to say here, is that Satan is going to be bound for a long period of time. But one thing we know about this long period of time, it's not eternal, because verse 3 tells us that there's going to be a completion to this 1,000 years. So it is going to come to an end. So what does this verse tell us, these verses? If you boil it down, this passage is telling us that Satan will be bound for a very long period of time, and then he will be unbound for a short period of time. And to read much more into it than that is conjecture. But that's what this passage is trying to tell us. Now, I think we need to, like we did before, consider what did John actually see? What's he telling us about this binding of Satan in these verses? In verse 1, he saw an angel with a key. And a key is symbolic. A key is a symbol of authority. It's a key to use to control and to lock and unlock, to control access. He also saw in verse 1 the abyss. Your translations might call this the bottomless pit. And as we've talked in class before, this is the spiritual underworld where Satan and evil spirits are confined. We also saw in verse 1, he saw a chain. And a chain is symbolic also. A chain is a symbol of restraint, and it represents Satan being bound and being restricted in his activities, particularly as it states his activities, his ability to control nations has been denied him. Then in verse 2, we saw the dragon, the serpent of old, who's the devil and Satan, according to John. Then John saw the angel bind Satan for 1,000 years in verse 2 and cast him into that bottomless pit in verse 3. So the vision that John saw of Satan and his armies means that he has now been defeated. And according to verse 3, the purpose of him being cast into the abyss was to prevent him from deceiving nations. Therefore, he cannot execute the persecution against Christians and against the church like he once had so freely. He doesn't have that ability right now. And Satan's power to deceive is severely curtailed. He can no longer control nations or to deceive people against their will. He can still influence people, as I said before, and he can sway us to his way of thinking. Satan is confined, and he is not helpless. I kind of think about Satan during this time frame of being a vicious dog on a chain, if you can get that image into your mind. He is still extremely dangerous, and if you get too close to him, he will still attack you. So that's kind of the image that we're left with there. Now, beginning with verse 4, something very different. And verses 4 and 6 are just so important for our understanding of the entire book of Revelation. I can't really overstate how important this next section is, because this is going to tie back things that we discussed and learned about in the beginning of the book of Revelation here to chapter 20. Who he's talking about, I'm going to explain this further, but who he's talking about right now are the martyred souls, those who had been butchered, beheaded during the Great Tribulation, during the Great Persecution. These are the souls that were under the altar back in chapter 6, crying out for vengeance. That's who he's talking about now, here starting with verse 4. So here's what John said. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. It's not saying they were being judged. It was saying they have been given the ability to be judges, to bring about judgment. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. So John wants to make it very clear who he's talking about here. He's talking about martyrs. He's talking about those who overcame, as we talked about early on in this study. And then he says here, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Again, there's that very long period of peace that we're in right now. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection, and then a blessing. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, and they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. That is just a very inspiring passage to me, even now in our modern time, and I can only imagine how inspiring this must have been to first century Christians who were worried about their friends who had become martyrs. This is the outcome of that scene. So verses 4 through 6 foretells how Christ will keep his promises that he made to the persecuted early Christians, particularly the ones who overcame. That was one of the code words that I defined for you early on in the class, the ones who had become martyrs during the Great Tribulation. And he identifies this occurrence as being the first resurrection. In verse 4, John saw the souls of the martyred for Christ seated on thrones, and thrones represent kingly authority. And these martyrs, as I told you, they're being given the ability to bring judgment against those who were responsible for their deaths. And these are the souls of the beheaded martyrs that John saw under the altar when the fifth seal was opened back in chapter 6. And now in chapter 20, they're no longer under the altar. We know that they've already been given robes. We saw that earlier as well. But a resurrection has occurred. A resurrection of martyred believers has now taken place, and the text refers to this resurrection as being the first resurrection. I know that's confusing. I'll try to put a slide up here that will explain that in just a moment. So that's verses 5 and 6. This first resurrection is the resurrection of the souls that were under the altar, the martyrs who had been crying out to the Lord for vengeance upon those who had taken their lives and butchered them, back in chapter 6, verse 10. In this third vision, these martyred souls are now seated with authority on thrones and sharing in Christ's victory. They have been exalted and given authority to judge along with the Lord. And this shows that those who had been martyrs for Christ were now victorious in the long run because Christ had overthrown Satan and they were enjoying eternal life. And how do I know they were enjoying eternal life? Is because verse 6 tells us that second death, the lake of fire, has no power over them. They don't have to worry about the lake of fire. So let's decode this just a little bit, because I know this is kind of confusing. What is a first death? What is a second death? What is a first resurrection? What is a second resurrection? Some of these are going to be better defined in verses that we'll get to next week, but for our understanding, I thought it was good. I want to put a definition up here for all of those terms right now for you. First death is no mystery to us. This is a physical death. This is the death that we experience at the end of our life. This is a separation from life on earth. It's a permanent separation. Once we die, we don't come back to life, but this is a physical death. So first death is a physical death that we will all experience, unless we're still alive when Christ returns, of course. But it's something that will be in the future for almost all of us, I'm sure. Now, the text describes something about a second death. And what is a second death? According to Revelation, this is a spiritual death, and it defines it as the lake of fire. This is a permanent separation from the presence of God. So the first death is a physical death. The second death is a spiritual death. The first death is a separation from life on earth. The second death is a separation from God. Got all that? Not all souls are going to experience a second death. Only the wicked evildoers, only those that are not going to spend an eternity in heaven, only those who do not have their name written in the Lamb's book of life are going to the lake of fire. But those that are saved, those that are going to be in heaven, will never experience a second death. They'll experience a first death, more than likely, but not a second death. So understand the difference. First death, physical. Second death, spiritual. Then, this text introduced to us this concept of the first resurrection. And a first resurrection, according to this text, this occurred with the martyred believers. These were the souls that were beheaded, Christians who were under the altar. They were beheaded and they became martyrs during the Great Tribulation. They're no longer under the altar. They have been brought back to life. They have been seated on these thrones. This is what the text describes as the first resurrection. And when we get to verse 12 and 13, it will tell us that the second resurrection has not yet happened. The first resurrection has already happened. The second resurrection has not happened. The second resurrection will be all those who died prior to the final judgment. And this is associated with the final judgment at the great white throne of God that will be described in chapters 12 and 13. So, first resurrection and a second resurrection. Now, to unravel a little bit more, let's talk about promises made and promises kept. I told you this is just a remarkable passage to me because it ties so much of Revelation together. If you think back to the letters to the seven churches of Asia Minor, 7 letters to 7 churches, I pointed out to you in our study that at the conclusion of every one of the letters, Christ had some sort of statement to the one who overcame or the one who overcomes. And he was talking about those martyrs. He was making special promises about heavenly blessings to those who had overcome. Let's remind ourselves, in Ephesus, he said to the one who overcomes, I will grant to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God, back in chapter 2. And the tree of life is not found on earth anymore. It's in heaven. It's in God's presence. In the letter to the church of Smyrna, he wrote to the one who overcomes, will not be hurt by the second death, back in chapter 2. What did we just get through reading in our passage? The second death will have no power over them. And the letter to Pergamum, he wrote to the one who overcome, I will give some of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone. And I explained at that time, hidden manna is hidden on earth. It's not available to us on earth. The only place to find it is in heaven. So this is a promise of heaven. And this white stone was innocence. They would be found innocent of all charges. To the church in Thyatira, to the one who overcomes, he said, I will give him authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And just very similar to what we just got through reading. To the church in Sardis, he wrote, they will be clothed in white garments. And what have we learned about everyone that we've seen in heaven? They're all wearing these white robes. So this is a promise of heaven again. And he says, I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. So promise is being made here. Philadelphia, he wrote to the one who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore. So they're going to become a permanent fixture in heaven based on this promise. And I love the one in Laodicea. He said to the one who overcomes, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat with my Father on his throne, back in chapter 3. So that's exactly the image that we're seeing in chapter 20. And let's just remind ourselves of the passage that we just got through reading in chapter 20, that in verse 4, John saw thrones and they sat on them. Also in verse 4, he saw judgment was being given to them. He saw that they came to life and they will reign with Christ. And then in verse 6, he saw a blessing being given to them. Blessed and holy is the one who has part in this first resurrection. And he says, over these the second death has no power, and they will be priests of God and of Christ, and he will reign. They will reign with him for 1,000 years. So promises made back in chapters 2 and 3, promises kept here in chapter 20. It's a beautiful way of tying the book of Revelation together for these martyred souls. Now, we are out of time, but I do want to make one short point here next. Let's do a little bit of unraveling. All through the book of Revelation, we have been studying predictive prophecies. And I wanted to make a distinction for you right now in this junction in our study of predictive prophecies past versus predictive prophecies future. Everything that we've seen all the way up to this point, chapter 20, verse 6 and earlier, have all been predictive prophecies that have already occurred in our lifetime. They occurred within the first few centuries after the original audience that received the book of Revelation. So these predictive prophecies have already been fulfilled. But right now in our study, we are at a crucial junction. Everything that we're going to read from this point on, beginning with chapter 20, verse 7, has not yet been fulfilled. This is uncharted water. This is new territory that we're moving into. So I want you to be aware that we are at that inflection point in our study. So where we are right now, in Revelation 27 marks that transition point, and here out the predictions of events that we will read in the book of Revelation have not yet been fulfilled. And I'm going to leave you on that big cliffhanger today. Read ahead. You can read about the final judgment, and you can read about the New Jerusalem, and all of this we're still looking forward to in the future. So again, I hope that you found this study interesting and beneficial. Thank you for laboring through this with me. We've got a couple more weeks to go, and then we'll be turning the class back over. Thank you very much.